This is the Chapter 11, Section 1 podcast, and it's on the work of Gregor Mendel. We're talking about genetics now. And genetics is the scientific study of heredity, which is essentially how traits are passed on from one organism to its offspring. And Mendel was an Austrian monk, and there's a picture of him in his garden working with his peas. And this is the important thing, is he worked with ordinary pea plants, which offered a lot of advantages to him. They were readily available, they were easy to take care of, but most importantly, they had very distinct traits to them, and they reproduced very rapidly, so he could look at a lot of generations very quickly. So Mendel knew that the male part of the pea plant produces pollen, which is sperm. It's the male reproductive cell. And the female part of the flower produces egg cells. And as we know, during sexual reproduction, sperm and the egg joins in a process called fertilization. And this is true for humans, but it's also true for pea plants. And the fertilization produces a new cell, which then becomes a organism. So they are self-pollinating, which means that ordinarily the sperm cells in the flower fertilize egg cells in the same flower. So that's self-pollinating. So they don't actually pollinate each other, they pollinate themselves, and they're able to reproduce from there. And the seeds that are produced inherit all the characteristics through self-pollination, inherit all the characteristics from the plant that bore them, which pretty much means it's the same plant. It's going to be very much the same. So here's a picture of it. Here's the stigma, which is the female reproductive part, and here's the anther, which is the male reproductive part. That's where we get the pollen from. So what Mendel did was he made sure he had true breeding pea plants that would produce offspring identical to themselves if they self-pollinated. And that was very important because he wanted to make sure he knew that particular plant he was using only produced purple flowers and not white flowers. So then what he wanted to do was take the seeds from two different plants, and wanted to produce a seed from two different plants by taking the male cell from one plant and the female cells, the sperm and the egg, from two different plants. So what he did was he cut away the pollen-bearing male parts of the plant, and then dusted the plant's flower with pollen from another plant. So what he did was he took the sperm cells from one plant, the pollen, and deliberately put it on another plant, and did not allow the plant to self-pollinate. So here we go. This is what he did. He did it with a little brush, and we call this process cross-pollination. And what he did was he produced seeds that had two different parents. So they were, see what the mix. So they got traits from each of the parents. A trait is a specific characteristic that varies from one individual to another. And this is an important definition. Let me go back to that. And you can see here's someone who has curly hair, straight hair, dark hair, light hair, brown eyes, blue eyes. These are all considered traits, anything that makes us different, even a bent pinky finger. So Mendel took 7 pea plants, and he chose 7 pea plant traits that were very contrasting, meaning it was very easy to see the difference between them. Color was a great one. He used yellow and green seed color. He used purple and white flower color. He used yellow and green pod color. And he used other things where the pods or the peas were wrinkled, where the flower was on the plant, the stem cells on the plant. Stem length. And so he crossed plants with each of the 7 contrasting characteristics and looked at the offspring. So we need to talk about the generations. You have the pea generation, which is the first set of parents. Then the offspring from that are called the F1, or first filial generation. And the offspring between these parents with different traits are called hybrids. The offspring of crosses between parents with different traits are called hybrids. So the first filial generation were hybrids. Now what he found is that the F1 hybrid plants all had the characteristic of only one of the parents. In other words, when the round was crossed with the wrinkled seed-shaped plant, all the offspring were round. Yellow and green, all were yellow. So just to give you an example, so he found that one trait always showed up in the F1 generation and the other trait did not. So the F1 hybrid parents had only the character of one of the parents. And here's the other ones. This is the pod shape and the pod color. So his first conclusion was that it was determined by factors. The biological inheritance is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next. And this is an important point for Mendel's thinking. And today what we call the factors that determine these traits, we call them genes. So there is a gene for, say, seed shape. And the gene, one of the factors is round and one of the factors is wrinkle. So each of the traits was controlled by one gene that occurred in two contrasting forms that produced different characters for each trait. And here we go. Here's one contrasting form, the smooth pod shape, and then you have the constricted pod shape. And these are just looking at all the different traits that he looked at. So the different forms of the gene are called alleles. So there was an allele for smooth pod shape and allele for constricted pod shape. His second conclusion is called the principle of dominance. What is the principle of dominance? The principle of dominance, once again, this is one of those important things. The principle of dominance states that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. So the dominant allele for a trait, if the organism has a dominant allele in their genes for the trait, it'll always exhibit that form of the trait. This is another way of saying the principle of dominance. So an organism with the recessive allele for a trait will exhibit that form only when the dominant allele for the trait is not present. So the only way a pea pod could be constricted, which is kind of like a wrinkle shape, is only if it has has a form for the yellow pea pod, but does not have a form. I'm sorry, we're talking about constricted pea pod, but doesn't have an allele for the smooth. It has to not have it anywhere in its genes. So what happens during segregation? Well, what is segregation? Mendel crossed the F1 generation. Remember, these are the hybrids, the ones that only showed one of the characteristics of two of the parents, to produce an F2 generation. So what he did was he self-pollinated that F1 generation. They crossed with themselves, and the traits controlled by the recessive alleles suddenly reappeared in 1/4 of the F2 plants, and I'll show that to you here. Let's look at the three generations again. Here's the P generation. So let's use tall and short for this example, and it could be yellow or green peas. It could be yellow or green pods. It could be wrinkled or smooth pods. It's all relevant. He crossed a tall plant with a short plant. From that, the F1 generation, he only got tall plants from that. All his plants were tall. Then he took that F1 generation and crossed them with themselves, and that's what this X means, is that the tall plant is crossed with another tall plant, and he ended up with 3 tall plants for every 1 short plant. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. That's important, a 3-to-1 ratio, and we talked about ratios already. We've talked about ratios already, so you should know what that means. It's a 3-to-1 ratio. So for instance, maybe he produced 400 plants, 300 of them would be tall, and 100 of them would be short. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. So what he assumed was that the dominant allele had masked the corresponding recessive allele in the F1 generation right here. So even though the recessive allele might be present, it wasn't going to show up because the dominant allele was there. And then the trait controlled by the recessive allele then showed up in some of the F2 plants. It showed up in the next generation after that. So the reappearance of the trait controlled by the allele indicated that at some point the allele for shortness had been separated or segregated from the allele for tallness. And when we mean separated, we mean removed from, separated from, not attached to. So what this suggested was that the alleles segregated from each other during the formation of sex cells, or what we call gametes. And here are two gametes. Here's a human egg cell, and here a human sperm cell trying to reach the egg cell. We call these cells gametes. So when the F1 cell produced gametes, the two alleles segregate from each other so that each gamete carries only a single copy of the gene. It either carries a tall allele or a short allele in the sex cell, in the pollen, in the sperm or pollen, in the egg cell. So that each of these plants, each plant produces two types of gametes, one for tallness and one for shortness. And we see this is true for a lot of things in human beings even. For instance, a very easy one is that you end up producing, parents end up producing, a father ends up producing gametes that can make a girl or make a boy. Now, so the alleles separated during gamete formation. Let's look at this. Here's the F1, and the F1 goes to make the gametes, goes to make the sex cells. So here's one organism right here, and it goes to make the sex cells, and it makes one with a big T, the dominant allele, and one with the recessive allele. We write this is T for tallness, and we write it in the uppercase if it's dominant, and a lowercase if it's recessive. So T for tallness. And then the F2 generation, say this is a sperm cell, and it meets up with a sperm cell here, meets up with an egg here, so to speak, and you end up with one that has the big T from here, the dominant allele, and the recessive allele from here. And this organism here would be tall because it has the dominant allele there. Let's look at this one over here, which is more interesting. Here's the recessive allele for this sperm cell, say, and it meets up with a recessive allele for this egg cell here, and now we end up with a short one. It has both of the recessive alleles. So this offspring would be recessive. And you look, tall, 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 three talls, one short, 3-to-1 ratio. On to the quiz.